Welcome, everyone. I wanted to also introduce my guest, Alex Kruglov. He is a former classmate, and he's also, more importantly, a former executive at Hulu. And in this segment, we're going to discuss what you as an author need to do in order to sell your content to Hulu. We're going to try to get into a lot of detailed information around that. And Alex, why don't you take it away and give a much more detailed background about why you are uniquely qualified to answer this amorphous question for many people who are out there and want to know.
Thanks for having me, Sean. Since you and I met, we've both grown beards, and unfortunately, we have far too much gray. So we're revealing our age. We've known each other for a very long time. I was part of Hulu's founding team. So I joined Hulu in 2007. Before it existed, it was just named like literally days before I joined, and it launched about 4 or 5 months after I joined as a direct-to-consumer service. So I was deeply unqualified for the role that I had, which was initially co-head and eventually head of content acquisition. So Hulu started out as a distributor of third-party programming, and it expanded into original programming, which was started when I was there, which I led, but then it continued for quite some time and is now flourishing. Emmy winning and all that good stuff, which kind of, much of it has happened after I left. So to some extent, I'm not qualified in that I haven't been there for a while, but I'm still, pretty closely connected to that world. And as well as, my former colleagues are now running Warner Media and are at places like Peacock and Netflix and a variety of other places, folks that I've hired, folks that I work with. So it's the world has sort of expanded, but also this converged at the same time, where it used to be that the Hulus of the world were more akin to YouTube as far as kind of digital distribution platforms where they didn't really have budgets to finance original production. Whereas the Hulu of today is much more similar to Showtime, HBO, Netflix, Amazon, Apple TV, FX, Disney Plus, you name it. So to answer the question that you asked, which is how does one get their story told in a visual setting for a hefty budget, which is essentially a way to rephrase your question, which is how do you get your show on Hulu? There are multiple ways, but the simple answer is that it's a supply and demand market. So those who have a direct-to-consumer service, those who are in the business of distributing films and TV shows, they're heavily motivated and incentivized to have hits and also to have volume of product that people want to see. They want to, at the end of the day, they want to pay as little as possible for it. But because of the way the market is set up, they're actually willing to pay a significant premium if they feel that the content can be the kind of stuff that can give them clout, whether it's by winning awards or by getting a lot of viewership. And sometimes those are two different things. So sometimes the kind of content that gets you awards is the stuff that nobody watches. And the kind of stuff that gets you viewership is the kind of stuff that all the critics trash, right? And so, the Kardashians are a very, very major part of the Comcast ecosystem, but they're not. Their show was not winning them. Awards. I wrote an opinion piece a while back with a friend of mine named Matthew Ball, and we talked about how Nickelback is one of the best-selling bands of the 21st century, but it's not on anybody's top 10, 50, or 500 list. And Dr. Pimple Popper is one of the top rated series on television. So there's this concept of like what is pulling an audience in, right? Which is around either prestige or the fact that your friends are talking about it. The Bachelor is in the latter category.
Word of mouth, right?
Handmaid's Tale is in the former category, and then there's so that's pulling a subscriber in, and then the other question is what is keeping a subscriber from unsubscribing, and so if you think about Discovery television, a lot of non-scripted programming, a lot of the times you don't subscribe in order to watch whether it's food shows or reality shows, but you actually stick around to watch them because they're a really good way to pass the time. So that's just kind of a general framework for how these people think and what's kind of top of mind to them. Now let's talk reality. There is a supply and demand, despite the position that most independent writers are in. there's a supply and demand imbalance that is heavily in favor of the content creators, not in favor of the content buyers. So there is a very small number, at least from a perception standpoint, of content creators who can make the kind of television that will draw an audience in and who know how to run a show, which essentially means being a CEO of a 500-person team that is making, a 6 to 10 episode per season show. It's massive cast, production, writer's room. All of that stuff is really, really hard to do. And so the J.J. Abramses of the world, the Issa Raes of the world, these people are, they have very, very hefty sums of money that they're being paid for being able to kind of bring shows in, and also for de-risking the likelihood that the show isn't just a good idea, but something that can get made and can get and can actually make it onto air and look good. And nobody ever sets out, by the way, to make a bad show. It kind of works out that way because of just the reality of how hard it is to do it. It's actually, as you know, there's a lot of really bad movies, but it's a lot easier to make a movie than it is to make a TV show, because you got to keep making it, episode after episode, season after season, and so on. So if you can come in with a pitch that puts together a good idea.
So let's back up real quick. So
sure.
I want to make sure that I segment the audience here, because there's going to be a lot of folks who, are screenwriters in Hollywood and things like that. This part of the show is not for them. This part of the show is for someone who is a novelist, or
Totally.
somebody like me who published an anthology and wants to make a show on net. Again, I'm not saying I want to. I'm just someone similar who did something like Weird World War III and wants to make an anthology show for Netflix or Hulu.
Yes.
So, but with no context whatsoever. Now, I can't say that because I know you, but I haven't badgered you or anything like that. But for someone with no contact whatsoever, how do they break into this process?
Yeah.
And then, so like, what is like what do the stages look like? Do they need to partner with somebody more experienced?
Yeah.
Where do they look for someone to reach out to?
The reality is that you need an in. So it is not a meritocratic system where if you just happen to have written the best book based on some objective basis, you win. So there's a few ways to kind of to break through the clutter, because there's a massive amount of incoming submissions that are not even read. Because as you know, unsolicited submissions are, for legal reasons, nobody reads them because they're concerned about getting sued in case there's something similar. So they will always reject anything that is unsolicited. So what are the ways to break through the clutter? Number one, have a really, sell a lot of books. So if you sell a lot of books, there's a lot of people who are paid to look at the volumetric trends of book selling, and who are aggressively going after books, including unpublished, so manuscripts that are not yet out, because there tends to be a war to take these off the shelves. Now, let me be clear. That doesn't mean your show gets made. It just means that somebody pays you a small amount of money for an 18-month option. That's all it is. But still, that's interest, and that means that you now have representatives who are kind of getting in business with you. So that's number one. Number two.
So I'm going to keep this super basic. So for people, I know what an option is. You know what an option are.
An option is nothing more than somebody saying you cannot sell this to somebody else for the period of time that an option lasts. During that time period, I'm going to try to make something out of this thing. If I succeed, the option extends and it becomes a thing. If I fail, which 99% of them do, then you get your rights back. So as a seller, you want the option to be as short as humanly possible, and you want to get paid as much as possible for it.
So in terms of ranges, if there is any range, there's probably not. It's probably all over the place. But what is kind of the length, if you take kind of the kind of middle 50%, right?
Yeah.
Where the bulge of that normal curve is. What's the range and kind of duration from X months to Y months?
18 months would be in the middle of the bell curve. Less than that probably means you have leverage. as a seller. More than that means that somebody has a lot of leverage over you, or that you just have a very bad
That's
reps
actually
on your end.
that's a very insightful. Like that's not something that somebody fresh in the industry would understand. That's
Yeah,
really
yeah,
interesting.
yeah. I
And then
mean,
what about
in a back and forth, they will tell you I need 3 years, and you will tell them, why the hell do you need 3 years? They'll say, because it takes a long time to do a thing. And whereas the reality is, the way the option agreement is structured is that as long as they move it to another level, like there's some kind of a buyer, there's some kind of a thing that happens to it, it automatically extends anyway. So what they usually do is they just take it off the table. And the problem for you as a writer is, if somebody bought your an option on your book and then nothing happens, your book is no longer interesting or relevant. It becomes stale. So unless you have a second publishing, or unless a paperback version comes out or whatever else, you're kind of shit out of luck. So you want this period to be as short as possible. And the reason you want to get paid as much as possible is not for the money. It's really so that they have a reason to work hard for you, because they shelled out real money. So if they wrote you $100 check for the option, of course it's a ridiculously small amount, but that's not the problem. The problem is that they're like, who cares? Whatever, it's $100. As opposed to whereas if they wrote you a $25,000 or $50,000 check for the option, well, even though it's recoupable, they're like, well, shit, I better work hard, otherwise I just lost 25 grand, right? It's real money.
Yep. And so we have the duration kind of range we just talked about. What about kind of the range and what you might get for an initial option? It sounds like
it can be very small amount. Like it can be as little as $50 or $100. Like sometimes it's just you need to pay something, otherwise the agreement doesn't work. But it can be very, very small amounts. Whereas if you're Stephen King, it can be well over $1 million, right? So it really depends. There's not a good answer. There's not a good way to answer that question.
Okay, all right. So we kind of have the option piece. So for somebody who's like a novelist, internal teams at like Hulu and Netflix are looking at, I'm assuming, book scan numbers if they're looking
less so Hulu, Netflix, more a producer. So generally the person who will buy it will be a producer or a production company. And then what they will do is they package it. So packaging means that they put a team together that's not you. So no offense to all of you and your novelist friends, but for the most part, unless you are one of the very small, rare exceptions that has kind of transformed and gone back and forth between TV and film, generally they want to find a different writer to actually put together a script or a Bible for your series. And you want to attach big names. Attach means that they are saying that they will do it, subject to a variety of different, it's not even a legal agreement. So an attachment is basically just says such and such read the book, likes it, and want to star in it. And so the way to, I'll go back in time in a second, but generally the way to sell a show is to make it attractive. The way to make a show attractive is to have a high quality piece of intellectual property, which is the book itself, right? That's a small part of it. The big part of it is that you have talent attached that can move dollars. So whether it's a writer that's in-demand, high-profile writer who has either already made TV shows or has at least been in the writing room in a popular TV show that did well, it's talent. So star, big star, and directors and a variety of and production company, big producer. All of those make a package attractive. That's generally kind of how it works. Now, as a no name in Hollywood, no name writer, how do you get into all of that? Well, one is to have a huge hit, right? That's one way to do it. Another way is to get representatives. So what are representatives? Representatives are people who work on your behalf. There are three categories of representatives. There is a lawyer, an agent, and a manager. So, and I think most of the people watching this know what a lawyer does. The difference between an agent and a manager is kind of random and vague, but there's legal reasons why an agent can't produce and a manager can't negotiate agreements. That's generally kind of how it goes. And a lawyer, ironically, a lawyer can actually theoretically do both. So there are some lawyers that actually do the job of a manager and agent, and vice versa. And the other thing is that if you are, so a friend of mine, actually a classmate of ours, is a very successful nonfiction writer who's sold a lot of books and also has done some ghostwriting. And he's read by.
Is that Philip?
Yes. So, and
Yeah,
he's
yeah.
rep by William Morris, which is a extremely prestigious agency. On the literary side, crossing over into film is not that easy for him, because even though the agency represents plenty of showrunners and screenwriters and whatever else, it's a non-trivial transition. So just because you have a fancy book agent doesn't necessarily mean that you have an easy path into television and film. And again, in his case, he was doing specifically work directly for TV. Selling an option to your book is a different story, but you then have to kind of hand it off and let other people do the work for you if you have a fancy agent. Whereas if you are a fancy novelist and then you separately wrote a screenplay that's unrelated to your fancy novelist work, you now have kind of brought yourself down to the level of any other new screenwriter, and you have to compete on the merits of that script just the same way that everybody else does, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So let's say that you've done all of this. So you have your reps, you have the person, somebody optioned your book, and they've put together a package around your book. So now,
well, let's step back. So
sure.
How do you get to the point? So for most of the audience, getting an agent, that's pretty understandable. Sometimes they use lawyers, sometimes they don't. But the manager piece, how does a novelist attract it? Because the manager's the one who would kind of bring in the production company. And
no, not necessarily. No? Not necessarily. There's really no difference between an agent and a manager when it comes to intros. So you just want to get to somebody who is connected. It can be a lawyer too. So if your lawyer happens to work for a firm that is heavily present in media, all they have to do is just call over a different, somebody whose office is next to theirs, and just say, hey, we represent Ellen. Would Ellen be interested in producing this thing? Let's get this book out to her. And there are a number of people in the film and TV world that read a lot of books. So he has recently been disgraced, but there's a legendary producer named Scott Rudin, and Scott Rudin is famous for having an army of people that would just read every book there is, usually before they come out. They would just get all of these manuscripts from publishers, and they would just take them off the table before they're ever released.
So that's how they get access to these books that they make deals.
Yeah, you might have noticed there's a lot of prestige movies that are based on books, and a lot of them have Scott Rudin's name on it. The reason that they have Scott Rudin's name on it is because he optioned them before they were literally before they even came out. So if you're a big writer like Franzen or Zadie Smith or whatever else, generally your book will be optioned well before it's released.
Okay.
And then like Reese Witherspoon is another one. So Reese Witherspoon has similar aspirations, and she has something called Reese's Book Club, where similar to Oprah's, but in a smaller way, where she aggressively options books to make. So recently she made Little Fires Everywhere, which was on Hulu, based on Celeste Ng's book, and I'm sure Celeste. Again, she's a big writer, so every time she writes a book, somebody will have optioned it before it comes out, most likely.
Okay, all right. So the initial path for a writer is to make sure that they have the right agent, manager, and/or legal representation, and then they obviously have to write a killer book in order to get that interest.
It doesn't have to be good. It just has to either break through the clutter, or it has to have something in it that can spark interest in the creative types. And it doesn't have to be a book. It can be an article. As you know, there's lots of Vanity Fair and Vogue and Rolling Stone articles that have been optioned and made into movies and TV shows.
Now, is there a way to kind of stack the deck in terms of getting your work around in a way that will increase the probability that somebody notices it and picks it up?
It's always about gatekeepers. So this entire ecosystem is made up of gatekeepers, and there's a lot of kind of mid-level people whose job it is to prevent you from getting your stuff to somebody. The way to break through gatekeepers is to have somebody who has the power to get your project around the gatekeeper. So the managers and the agents and lawyers, that's literally what they do. But the other way is to just know somebody famous, or to have a sister-in-law who knows somebody famous and get it to them. Like, that's kind of the other way.
That gets to my next question, which is going to be controversial, but it'll equally offend all parties. So, but I'll be very careful about how I ask it. So, in terms of kind of getting your thing out there, there could be some, elitism, some nepotism, potentially racism, ageism, and what I call imbyism, which is in my backyard. Do you have to be living in LA to do this stuff?
100%.
So when I say elitism, to be clear, like people with Ivy League backgrounds, is there a bias against people who don't have them, et cetera? And both of us were speaking as people with that sort of a pedigree, right?
Yeah.
And so it could benefit. It might hurt you. Historically in Hollywood, being a person of color was a disadvantage. Right now,
Yes.
is it an advantage? Is it still a disadvantage? So it's things like that. So if you're kind of approaching this business, what are the sorts of things that you have to watch out for? So let's start with elitism. Like, is that really a thing?
Yeah, so all of those things are real, and you absolutely are spot on in mentioning them. I mean, the reality is this middle tier of gatekeepers, almost all of them are young. Almost all of them live in either Los Angeles or London, if you're sort of international. But they're generally they live in a very specific area of the world, and they have a very specific way in which they live their lives. A lot of them, almost all of them, are heavily underpaid. So what that means is that they usually come from wealthy backgrounds, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to have these jobs. Right? Yeah. It's very hard to live in Los Angeles on less than $30,000 a year, right? And not only do they live in Los Angeles, they also have to go out to meals and those. Yes, they have expense accounts for those, but then they go out, at night. They date. Like it's not realistic to do that unless you have wealthy parents or somebody who's giving you the bandwidth to do that, because they don't make any money until they're reasonably senior in that corporate hierarchy. And so the biases. Everybody kind of tends to want to buy what they know, and they like what they like. And so as a result, when you have something that's completely different, it's much less likely that they're going to make a move on it, unless there's an explicit objective that their bosses set that basically says, we want to make more movies with Latino themes, right? And so, and realistically, the only way you're going to make a great movie that appeals to Latino audiences is if you actually have executives that are Latino. It's very, very difficult for non-Latino executives to meaningfully relate to a story that is set in East LA, where people are speaking Spanglish, right? And so when there's it's kind of half.
And in the same vein, to pick winners. At the end of the day, you're trying to pick winners.
That's right. That's right. You need to really know. You need to know how to tell an emotional tale, and it's much easier to understand how an emotional tale is told when it's told to you than when it resonates with you than if it resonates with a theoretical person who you're imagining. And so having people, it's a lot of things. It's age, it's gender, it's socioeconomic background, it's ethnicity, and also it's like view of the world. So whether it's people who are conservative, who are not willing to hear liberal voices, people who are liberal who are not willing to hear conservative voices, people who have before J.D. Vance became a bit of a pariah, basically everybody read his book, Elegy, right? Hillbilly Elegy, and that was like the one book that everybody talked about as like, okay, you gotta sort of hear from conservative voices. In film, if you notice how many movies and TV shows happen to be set in LA or New York, even though there's a lot of America that isn't LA or New York. And so when a movie like Napoleon Dynamite came out, I'm now dating myself, this is back 15, 16 years ago, it was it was set in a Mormon country in Utah. And that the only way that a movie like that could work, I mean, it did really well because it was so spectacular, but it was made independently. And it wasn't until it made it to Sundance that somebody actually saw it and said, holy shit, we got to buy this, which at the time was MTV Films and Fox Searchlight. But that movie, as good as it is, nobody bought it, until then, because it was so weird and different, because it didn't resonate. So the reality is that there are plenty of senior people who are setting objectives that says, hey, we need to make movies that appeal to older people. We need to make movies that appeal to people in the middle of the country. We need to make people that appeal to Chinese audiences, like all of those objectives. But it's very hard for the middle tier to be able to pick winners because all they know is what they know. Like that's just the reality of how it goes.
So I'm gonna go off on a bit of a a sidetrack based on something you said, but I want to try to keep it kind of bring us back on the path in terms of the stage of getting through this process.
Yeah.
You mentioned kind of a movie about that appeals to Chinese audiences, right? So I've read and I'm sure it's true that anything that you send over to the Chinese market, they heavily edit in
Correct.
order for it to kind of fit with the dictates of the Chinese.
Well, if they aired at all, I mean, they also have a system where even big Marvel movies sometimes they don't show.
So, if you have a movie that is, so as an example, I have another anthology that I'm working on called Weird World War III, China. Mm-hmm. Okay, that will never get made in China, and probably would never even be looked at in Hollywood because it would never.
No, it's a budget thing, Sean. Not at all. So being provocative and poking somebody in the eye is not a problem as long as the budget does not require the movie to be successful in China, right? So it's all about the budget, right? So if you make a movie for especially a documentary, you can make a documentary for $250,000, right? Like realistically, especially if you don't have to have expensive music. So a documentary that's made for $250,000, which is sold to Netflix and not shown in China, Netflix not available in China, is fine, right? But if you're making a movie that costs a few $100 million to make and you're expecting $1 billion in gross box office receipts, it's very hard to do that if you don't have a Chinese release, because that's a very large portion of the overall box office. In television, it's very different. And so now there's corporate relationships. So the question is, how aggressively are you poking your customer in the face? So Saudi Arabia is the other one, because that's not a market at all. But there's a lot of financing that's involved between Saudis and various media companies. And some big companies are just not willing to aggressively poke them in the eye, whether it's the Chinese, whether it's the Saudis, or some other examples in general. But Hollywood tends to; those are the two kind of common areas common sort of quote unquote foes to go after. And there's corporate reasons, and then they, we're all aware of the Spotify Joe Rogan back and forth, which has to do with, are you a platform or are you a publisher? Because you're paying for something, are you effectively a publisher? And there's actually, this happens on the film side too. So when you acquire a finished product, you sometimes can hide behind the fact that, well, we didn't make it. So yes, we paid for it for distribution, but we're not really the ones who made it. So don't worry about it. Like, it's okay if it's not really consistent with our points of view and stuff like that. It gets really hairy and complicated, and we can talk more about it or not, but it's probably not relevant for the majority of your audience.
Yeah. I think that's the only other piece that I want to ask you about is the flip side of that, which is, if you're making objectionable content to, let's say, the U.S. intelligence, like, is there any influence from U.S. intelligence agencies to try to shape products that, in the past, there has been, right? In the
80s and before. Yeah.
Yeah. Does that still exist? And again, I don't want to go too far out or branch out on this, but I figure
I'm not personally. It's fine. I'm not personally. I've never encountered it personally, but I will say that a good friend of mine was involved in the release of the movie, The Interview, which was the movie that caused Sony to get hacked, and the backstory there is quite interesting, because all of this ended up becoming a non-story eventually. But initially, everybody was afraid to release that movie because they were afraid. So Sony got hacked very badly. Yeah. And so the movie wasn't going to come out theatrically
by North Korea.
By North Korea, exactly. Which is everybody's enemy. No one's worried about offending North Korea, but what they were worried about was getting hacked by North Korea, because Sony got hacked so aggressively. And so at the time, so Sony decided, okay, we'll release the movie online, right? No problem. Well, the problem is there's only two ways to release a movie online. It either has to be on AWS, Amazon Web Services, or Google Cloud. And neither one was willing to host the movie, because they were like, it's actually a pretty, it wasn't exactly a great movie. And so they didn't want to, Netflix didn't want to release it. And neither of those two were not only not willing to release it directly, they were not willing for anybody to host it on their servers because they didn't want to get hacked. And so my friend's company got involved, and my friend was one of you guys. and ended up working directly with the U.S. government to get server allocation space and stuff like that to get the movie released. And the funny thing is that 2 days later, Amazon, Google, everybody did release it. So now it's on Netflix. You can watch it.
And it was first released on YouTube though, right? Like on Google's platform, right?
No, it was released on a website called theinterviewmovie.com, which my friend
I know because I bought it.
It was like $20 or something. Yeah.
Just funny aside, and then we'll get back. I'm like way off track. A funny aside about Google, I think back in the early 2010s, China hacked into Google and stole some of their code, search algorithms, things like that. Mm-hmm. So apparently Google hacked back.
That's interesting.
They basically attacked a sovereign state. And my understanding of the situation...
Was that around the time when they eventually withdrew from China, when Sergey Brin basically threw down and withdrew from China? Sounds like... So I remember that because I was at Hulu at the time. I remember that time frame. It was very, very fraught experience. I didn't know about the hacking.
But my understanding of that is I think the FBI got involved and things like that, because the last thing you want is a U.S. corporation to go rogue and start a kinetic war by hacking into. So anyway, we're kind of living in interesting times. So let's get back to. I'm sorry to take us on this digression. But,
sure.
Okay, so you're a novelist. You've gotten an option. You're kind of in the process.
Well, the other thing is you have to remember, a lot of the times you're no longer involved. Like if you're successful and it's going well, generally you're not really in the mix anymore. Occasionally they'll parade you out just to so if you have some clout, they'll bring you to the pitch meetings. So generally it's not Netflix or Hulu that does the optioning. Right. The vast majority of the time, it's usually a producer or a studio that does the optioning, and if it's a studio, it's usually a producer who's affiliated with the studio. So there's these things called the overall deal. An overall deal is like a holding deal where somebody like Shonda Rhimes, or J.J. Abrams, they're paid a lot of money to basically sit around and generate ideas. So they're paid, and so what ends up happening is Greg Berlanti, Shonda Rhimes, J.J. Abrams, what they'll do is they'll option a bunch of stuff. And then they'll put a writer on it. They'll put an executive producer on it. They'll try to put some talent. Talent means people who are on camera. So they're called above the line talent. And then those people will go and meet with Showtime, HBO, Hulu, whoever else, and pitch your show. And sometimes they'll bring you into the meeting and sometimes they won't. It kind of depends on what is appealing and what the story is and what the pitch is. So if it actually gets optioned, if it actually gets picked up, then maybe, they'll hire you as a consultant to kind of help with the scripts, but generally they kind of kick you out.
So that actually raises a question. There was a writer kind of sent me a question about this. Does charisma matter? So let's say they bring you into the room and you're like a human troll. Like does it matter?
It all depends. It depends if so generally, yes. I mean, the pitch has to work. So something about the pitch has to be effective. But a lot of the times the writer will just sit there and not say anything. I've taken a number of pitches which were based on well-known writers' work where I knew the writer and I was excited, and the writer wasn't there, and the writer wasn't involved in the pitch at all. It was adaptation type thing. And but generally the question is, okay, is this appealing? Is this the kind of thing that we want? The biggest reason somebody will buy it is not that. The biggest reason is to get somebody else to not buy it. So the number one way in which your show will get bought is if there's a perception that somebody else is gonna snatch it away from them.
It's the hot girlfriend problem. Yeah,
100% correct. So House of Cards, which was famously sold to Netflix for $100 million, 2 seasons, there were 3 other bidders, and Netflix outbid them both with more money and a bigger commitment, and most importantly for David Fincher, a guarantee that they would make the full seasons sort of sight unseen. And so that is the number one most compelling thing. But other than that, like the normal kind of pickup process, the question is this going to work? If it is what we think it is it going to work? Number one. If the answer is no, then you don't want it. And then number two is it's very similar to building a product. If you're a tech person, number two is what is the likelihood that it's going to get made close to what we perceive it to be, and that has to do with who the sellers are. So very famously, arguably the most successful show so far of the 21st century is Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones was an adaptation of an extremely successful book, as you know, book series. And he was barely involved in the pitching. But, Benioff and Weiss, the two individuals who were doing the adopting, they got paid a lot of money, and there was a huge budget to make the pilot of that series. And HBO saw it and rejected it. They didn't like it. And then they ended up paying a lot more money to completely reshoot the pilot and do it again. And only then, with the same creators, and only then, when it finally worked, did they decide to go. And it's one of the most expensive shows ever made, and also one of the most successful. Arguably, is HBO's big piece of content for so far. Now they're making prequels and all that other stuff.
So as a writer who has an option, how much control do you have over what happens to your baby?
Very little.
Very little.
None. I mean, if you're Stephen King, you have plenty. But if you're not a writer of who's kind of well known, you can negotiate all of that into your option. But then just means that people are less likely to do the option, right? If you have a veto power over the scripts or whatever else, it becomes, at best, they give you a consulting credit on the scripts, and they'll send you the scripts for feedback, but they won't necessarily have to take it.
Okay. And in terms of the other question that...
But hang on a second, Sean. There's also a big difference between scripted and unscripted. So if you've written an unscripted story, and they're making not a scripted version of it, but a documentary, then you can be very actively involved, because you're effectively the source, right? The source, or your sources are going to be the sources. You're going to have to help them get on camera. So then you become, full-on producer on the thing.
So when that studio reached out to me about one of my former companies, asking, I guess, to participate in some production, and I just ignored it, I would have had some control.
Well, they probably wanted you to be an on-camera, just a talking head, and a lot of times they don't even pay for that.
Yeah, that's what I figured, and it would be more trouble than it was worth, so I ignored it. Okay.
I don't know if you saw that there were two competing Fire Festival documentaries, and I recommend watching them both. One's on Netflix, one on Hulu. They literally came out the same week, and there were some incredible. I won't reveal to you what it is because it's worth seeing it, but there are some incredible on-camera statements that people made.
Yeah, you don't want to be that guy, right?
Well, that will be on your, Wikipedia, to the extent that you have a Wikipedia, or to the extent people Google your name, that will be on YouTube first for the rest of your life, unless you do something more notable.
Yeah, what do they call that? Who's the lead singer of was it Warrant? Cherry Pie, that song.
Yeah, I know the song. Sure, I don't remember the lead singer's name.
So I think he did not want to be remembered for that song.
There's a lot of those, one hit wonders. There's some plenty of true Hollywood stories. Yeah, remember the VH1 Behind the Music? Yeah, that's yeah.
Okay, so another question that you that was raised for me when you were talking about, as they're assessing these pitches, what sorts of things do they, what metrics or criteria do they use to say, oh, that's the one I want? Because I imagine there's some qualitative piece, but there's
that's a good question. So, and this is it's a little different actually with streaming companies and traditional networks, but the framework is the same, which is this going to appeal to our demographic? That's the core question. Now, so the way that a streaming company will think about it, so a typical streaming company that's sophisticated will basically say, here are the psychographic profiles of audiences that we're going after. And then you want to put kind of a check mark that says, okay, to whom does it appeal? And does it appeal in a big way? Like, will this be their favorite show? Or does it appeal in a small way where they won't hate it, but they might kind of put it on the list? So if you look through the trays are these long horizontal recommendations on Netflix, right? Generally, there's a little description as to why it is that you like it. Oh, you, Sean, I know you love romantic comedies with Jennifer Lopez, and because you love romantic comedies with Jennifer Lopez, here are a bunch of others with Jennifer Garner and others, that you would love to watch. In my case, I like more sophisticated fare.
I love my Jennifer Lopez.
because you like smart British crime shows, whatever, that's generally kind of how they do it. And so there's the traditional demographics, which is, men, women, different ages. And then there's psychographics, which is people who are into sci-fi, people who are into anime, people who are depressed, people who are, who really appreciate dark humor, that kind of stuff. Right. So to them, So generally they'll think about it and they'll say, okay, is this something that fits, that delights one of the demos? That's one dimension. Another one is brand. So FX is a network that has a very strong brand. There's this very strong perception to FX executives as to what FX stands for and what it doesn't stand for. And so the question is, does it fit within the FX family of shows? Is this something that we can be proud of? Another one is just generally like, how big can it be? What is the reason we're going to make this? Is this going to be a show that everyone's talking about, a water cooler type thing? Or maybe it's going to be maybe not, but it's going to be like Fleabag is a great example of, one of the greatest shows made, but it didn't have a huge audience, but it got like every award possible because it was, when it came to like the connoisseurs of television, all of them loved Fleabag. And so for Amazon, even though it didn't have a huge viewership, it was a big win. Now, Marvel's Mrs. Maisel is an example of a show that is both a big audience show and a critically acclaimed show. That's very rare. It doesn't happen very frequently, but nowadays it's kind of happening more than it used to. So that's generally kind of how they think about it. And then budget. If it's a period piece with a big cast, that can be extremely expensive. Whereas a show like Atlanta or It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, they're expensive now, but in the first season, they were reasonably inexpensive to execute. Some of them, British shows tend to have like one writer who writes all of the episodes. That can be a lot less expensive. In England, they don't have writers' rooms the way they do in the US. So that's a lot less expensive to do than something with a big writer's room.
That's
so
probably it's probably why they have fewer flops, I think.
They have, but they also do only 6-episode seasons typically.
Yeah. Well, how does that play into? So again, I just made a statement without any data to back it up whatsoever, right? It was just a gut feeling. But writers' rooms, and as these productions are being created, there are a lot of thoughts, right? A lot of people kind of injecting their thoughts.
Like cooks in the kitchen. Yeah.
How does that? Again, I'm going a little digression, but I'll bring it back. How does that impact work product and for like a novelist who doesn't want to see his product, kind of his or her product completely turned into hash? Like, what's that dynamic like? Is it generally
the biggest driver of something that's good and something, or at least that with a script, like for a television show, different from a movie. For a television show, the biggest variable of what's going to work and not work is the script. For a movie, it's a little different because it depends on, production and casting is really important. For a TV show, everything lives on the page. So obviously you can still mess it up with really good scripts, but you definitely will not have a successful show if your scripts suck. Like 100%, it will fail. And yes, there's writers' rooms. Usually there's 6 to 8 writers in a writer's room. The biggest driver of a successful writer's room versus not a successful writer's room is the showrunner. So the showrunner is also known as executive producer. This is a person who is in charge of all the different elements of making a TV show. In television, writer is king. In movies, director is king. So a good example of a successful showrunner is Mike Schur. So Mike Schur was a senior writer on The Office, and then he went on to co-create Parks and Rec. He then went on to co-create Brooklyn Nine-Nine, The Good Place. And he is somebody who has been very, very good at running comedy writers' rooms, which are very unruly. Comedy people tend to be, they tend to be all over the place. And also jokes are hard, like, writing good jokes and also smart scripts at the same time, which is what Mike Schur's known for, is really hard. So Mike is very in demand. Like, if Mike Schur is pitching you a TV show, you're just begging him to take your money. That's kind of how it goes. And then there's others who might have written a great comedic script, but who have no idea how to write a writer's room, right? And all of a sudden it gets away from them. And so you've probably seen some comedies where you notice that in season 2 or 3, it really starts slipping. And the reason that's the case is because the showrunners are just not capable of writing the scripts all themselves, because they have to do all these other things. And they're not able to really like quality control and make sure that the scripts are excellent. And also, like, there's a big difference between a network show, which is like 22 episodes a season, and a cable or Hulu Netflix show, which is more of like, 8 to 12 episodes a season, because it's much easier to have quality when you have fewer scripts. So almost never do you see a network comedy where every episode is good. It's just impossible. Hopefully your worst episode are just not terrible. That's your kind of goal.
All right. Going back on track, you go to these pitch meetings, you do the pitch, they run it through the metrics they have, look at different psychographic profiles. If it's a high penetration, means kind of big bang in one demographic, or they might have low penetration, but across a broad range of demographics. Either way, the movie kind of gets, let's just say it gets a green light. How does that process work? So the production company, right, is the one that's pitching to the distributor. Is that? And then
what happens is you sell your option. Then
Yep.
The production company has this time period during which they kind of staff it. So they package it. They put together a team to bring it to market, which either happens or it doesn't. The majority of the time it doesn't happen, and the option reverts back to you. And then, you're shit out of luck. Good luck with hopefully reselling it if you're lucky, or
they
more likely just writing your next book.
Yeah.
Maybe they'll extend it if you're willing to let them. Generally, I would be, if they've made no movement and it's been 18 months, I would not extend it, because they're just freezing your work for you. You can tell them, listen, keep selling it, but I'm not giving you the option. So I'll give you the option if you sell it, but in the meantime, I reserve the right to give it to somebody else. So again, like the percentages are horribly bad. So I just want your audience to be aware of just how low likelihood is that, the craft of writing is one that is individual. So it's you and your typewriter. That's all. That's the only thing that's preventing you from getting it out there. And you can self-publish nowadays, right? You don't need a publisher. When it comes to television and film, it just doesn't work the same way, and it's a frustrating process, and it's rough. So you option it. Best case scenario, they put together a package, they take it to market, they start selling it to buyers, and a buyer is a network, whether it's a digital network or a traditional network. If you're lucky, they'll buy it. Now, what does it mean when they buy it? It means virtually the same thing as the studio optioning it, which is that they basically say, we're going to pay you, the production company now, we're going to pay you to write a script. So what they now have done is they've taken the ability of anybody else to buy it off the table. So they'll pay the production company to get a script to them. If they like the script, they'll maybe ask for more scripts. And if they like those, they'll shoot, sometimes Netflix or Hulu or Disney Plus will go straight to series if it's really, really promising, or if it's the kind of show that requires a big production. So you have to build sets and you have to get costumes and all that stuff. And it's just not economical to shoot a pilot, because if you shoot a pilot, you have to then strike all of that stuff before you decide whether it's you green light it, and you end up spending $3-4 million. That's kind of a wasted money. But generally, they shoot a pilot, and if they like the pilot, then they'll order to series. If they don't like the pilot, then again, you're shit out of luck. So there's all these gates. So there's the does your book get optioned? Does it get packaged? Is there a network buyer? Does the network buyer like the script? Does the network buyer want to greenlight a pilot? Is the pilot any good, meaning the network likes it? Then it goes to series. So those are kind of the steps, all of which there's a significant fall off in all cases.
Now, how does the money flow to the writer in this case? So the first is the option. There's some money that flows to the writer.
Yeah.
What's the next stage where more money would?
Generally, there's stages, and I'm not an expert in exactly how those agreements are done. There's a number of lawyers that can answer that question more directly than I can. But generally, anytime, all of the phases that I just described, the writer gets paid something. And if the writer has a good representation, they also have what's called the back end, of the show or the movie. Meaning, if the movie does really well or the TV show does really well, they get a piece of the underlying intellectual property. So like the old school writers, Grishams of the world, Stephen King's, have made a lot of money from their movies, which did well in the box office, and they actually had a piece or have a piece of the underlying movie rights. There are a lot of writers who don't get a piece of the back end. So essentially, they just get paid out, and the thing just keeps getting made without them. If it's a TV show, not a movie, the good news you have as a writer is that you are the generator of the intellectual property, right? So if there's a season 2 and there's no sequel, they need you to give them ideas as to how to make it, unless the showrunner wants to go in a different path. But if you have good lawyers, they will have negotiated that the stuff has to be based on your intellectual property, and if they veer off, they need your approval, if you will. So a good example of that is Handmaid's Tale is based on a very, very famous novel by Margaret Atwood. They had to keep her involved for season 2 and 3, which are now like on a they've completely veered off the book, because the book ended in season 1 is the book, and then they kind of keep going beyond that.
Okay, all right. So you get to this stage. Let's say in the extremely unlikely case that the pilot is accepted, then what?
Generally, they'll hire you as a writer to be a consultant. So they'll basically say, you can hang around the writer's room and give some notes and advice, or they'll send you the scripts as new scripts are being written. So generally, what happens if a pilot is greenlit, they're now writing the season, and then they're going to start shooting. And so generally, as a writer, and the other thing is like just personal relationships. If you're kind of grumpy and annoying, regardless of what the lawyers do and negotiate, they can always tell you to go fuck yourself, right? And then you could say, what are you going to do? Stop the whole thing and not get paid? So like, if they don't like working with you, they'll figure out ways to not work with you. But even if you don't have any legal right for approvals or whatever else, if they like you and they get along with you and they think your ideas are good, they'll include you. These are all human beings, and no one means to be mean to a writer. That's never the intent. It's just that sometimes there's a lot of egos involved, and it just doesn't really work out really well. I mean, there's also counterexamples. So Tony Kushner, the famous playwright, he has worked I think on 4 different films now with Steven Spielberg, because they just have a great working relationship, including films like West Side Story, where why would Tony Kushner write West Side Story script? But he did, because Steven loves working with him.
Okay, that's definitely helpful. All right, I'm trying to think. There's any other questions that you typically get that I didn't cover? I mean, I got other random questions. Actually, here's a random question. Loglines, is that still a thing? Like,
yeah.
Like
it's definitely a thing.
X meets Y, is that still part of?
Well, I mean, it's less hokey now because there's more prestige in television and movies than there used to be. But yeah, loglines are still a thing. Because you want to be, it's an elevator pitch, right? It's the same thing as business, right? You want to be able to describe something and hook somebody. X meets Y, just for your audience who doesn't know, it means like one movie and another movie. Usually they have nothing to do with each other. And when you say X meets Y, somebody's head's supposed to explode. Like, oh my God, I've never heard that before. So in your case, it would be a Jennifer Lopez romantic comedy, maybe meets Napoleon Dynamite.
Or like Cthulhu, something like that.
Sure, exactly.
All right. Any other questions that folks typically?
Well, like MASH is a good example of that in your world, right? The military world. MASH was so brilliant because they took something that was like hardcore war stuff, right? And they brought it into like comedy. You at the time the pitch would have been like Catch 22, in Korea or whatever else, right? Like you had to. It was so different and so wildly not consistent with the mainstream that it had a huge hook on its own, like almost immediately.
And what are the probabilities we're talking here? We're talking like sub 1%, right? Something like that. From a novel to a movie is, if a novel's published, that's probably.
Well, Gary Steingart's a good example. So Gary Steingart has written, I think, 5 extraordinarily successful novels. Every single one of them has been optioned, and as far as I know, not a single one has been made into a movie or a TV show yet. So it's a lot of it just has to do with like execution. It's just there's a risk associated with execution where no matter how good the concept was, if whoever is empowered with translating it from the page to the screen can't quite handle it or doesn't quite have the vision, it doesn't work out. Like there's one of my favorite books of all time is A Confederacy of Dunces. That book has been optioned and has had everybody from Will Ferrell to I can't remember who else attached to star, and it still hasn't been made. I think there might have been an animated version or something like that that came out. Dune, as you know, has had multiple versions, and it wasn't until the recent one that they got any sort of decent reviews. Tron is another example. These are huge, huge properties, right? Yiddish Policeman's Union, Michael Chabon's book. Again, like there's been multiple versions that have been announced and whatever else, and there hasn't been one made yet. So it's tough even when you have literally all the the deck is fully stacked in your favor. It's still really hard because execution does matter a great deal.
All right. I don't have any further questions. I think you covered this backwards, forwards, up, down. I mean, this is really helpful, and I hope the audience
Awesome.
finds it helpful as well. So we're going to take
Glad
a
to be of
break
help.
now, and we're going to go talk about our next topic, which will be one of my perennial, I shouldn't say favorites because we're talking about bad things, but we're going to discuss Russia and the Ukraine situation. So talk to you soon.
All right.